Tuscany is famous for its rolling hills, the golden sunlight on cypress trees, and the timeless romance of the Renaissance. But beneath this postcard-perfect exterior, a shadow stretched across the countryside. In the secluded lovers' lanes surrounding Florence, a figure of pure malice turned the soft chirping of cicadas into a backdrop for nightmares. This was not a crime of passion. This was the work of the Monster of Florence, the Monster of Florence. Between 1968 and 1985, 8 double homicides would stain the Tuscan soil, leaving behind a trail of terror that paralyzed the nation. The killer's signature was as precise as it was terrifying. His victims were always young couples seeking privacy in their cars. Under the cover of moonless nights, the monster would approach with a .22 caliber Beretta pistol, loaded with Winchester Series H ammunition. The killings were efficient, but what followed was ritualistic. Using a sharp blade with the skill of a surgeon, the killer performed deadly mutilations on the female victims. These were not random acts. They were calculated and cold, signaling a predator who vanished into the olive groves before sirens ever sounded. As the body count rose, the initial confidence of the Florentine investigators crumbled. The public knew better. Fear became a palpable presence in the streets. Parents warned their children never to go out at night, and the romantic hills now felt like a predatory hunting ground. Early investigators, burdened by the pressure of a panicked citizenry, scrambled for leads. They were men of traditional methods, ill-equipped for a phantom who left no fingerprints and no witnesses, each only empty shells of copper-washed bullets and the silence of the dead. To understand the monster, one must look back to the tragedy of 1968. Barbara Loci and her lover were gunned down, while her young son slept in the back seat. The investigation was swift but flawed. Police focused on Barbara's husband, Stefano Melli, a man of limited intellect who was easily manipulated. Under pressure, Melli confessed to the murders, despite inconsistencies that would haunt the case. He was sent to prison and authorities declared the case closed. But there was a fatal oversight. The murder weapon was never found. While Melli sat behind bars, the real killer waited. The illusion of safety shattered in 1974 and again in 1981. It became undeniable that a serial predator was at work. This realization was a heavy blow to the ego of the Florentine police, because they were still using outdated methodologies, treating each crime scene as a localized event, rather than links in a chain. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The patterns were clear, yet bureaucracy hindered the flow of information. The monster seemed to be mocking them, evolving his tactics, while the authorities remained trapped in the past, unable to find him. The investigation was further paralyzed by a rivalry between the Florentine Carabinieri and the state police. Information was hoarded like treasure, and critical leads were lost in a labyrinth of paperwork and professional jealousy. Each branch wanted the glory of catching the monster, but their refusal to cooperate meant the left hand never knew what the right hand was doing. When this lack of communication allowed the killer to slip through the cracks, moving between jurisdictions with an ease that suggested he might be intimately familiar with the very system trying to catch his shadow. The tension reached a breaking point when a discovery was made regarding the physical evidence. Forensic technicians, finally comparing the gruesome ballistics from the latest murders with the 1968 case, realized the bullets were identical. Even more chilling was the revelation that the lot of Winchester ammunition used by the monster matched a box that was supposed to be under lock and key in police custody. This discovery suggested the bullets used for murder were already in the hands of the law a decade ago, and yet the gun was firing once again in the Tuscan night. It's the discovery of the missing ammunition sent shockwaves through the investigation. But instead of looking inward at their own failures, the authorities looked for a face to blame. They found that face in the rugged features of Pietro Pacciani, a farmer from Mercatale with a history of extreme violence. Pacciani was the antithesis of the romantic Tuscan ideal. He was foul-mouthed and had already served time for a brutal murder in 1951. He was the perfect monster. He was a man the public could easily hate, a villain who fit the profile of a savage predator. However, the focus on Pacciani required a dangerous level of forensic tunnel vision. Investigators began to bend the facts to fit the man. Witnesses who had seen a tall, athletic man near the crime scenes were ignored, as Pacciani was short and stocky. Blood evidence that did not match his type was sidelined. The prosecution began to build a narrative based on character assassination rather than scientific certainty. They painted a picture of a man driven by perverted impulses, ignoring the surgical precision of the mutilations, which seemed far beyond the physical capability of a clumsy, aging laborer. The turning point came with the discovery of a single unspent .22 caliber bullet in Pacciani's garden, known as the Vigna del Pacciani. It was hailed as the smoking gun, the definitive link between the farmer and the Winchester rounds used in the killings. Yet the circumstances of its discovery were deeply suspicious. The bullet was found in a patch of soil that had already been searched multiple times. It showed signs of being manually cycled through a firearm, but lacked the microscopic tool marks that would definitively link it to the monster's Beretta. Mario Spacey, a sharp-eyed investigative journalist for La Nazione, was one of the first to question the validity of this find. Spezzi had spent years walking the crime scenes and interviewing witnesses, and he couldn't reconcile the sophisticated phantom he had studied with the crude man in the dock. He began to suspect that the bullet had been planted by police, who were frustrated by their own inability to find real evidence. Spezzi's skepticism made him an enemy of the state, but it also opened a new, darker chapter in the saga. He saw the cracks in the official narrative and the failures of the previous Sardinian trail investigation. As he dug deeper, the case took a surreal turn. Realizing that Pacciani alone might not be enough to sustain a conviction, the prosecution introduced the concept of the compagni di merende, or snack buddies. This was a group of marginalized outcasts, including Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, who were accused of being a literal murder squad. The trial devolved into a grotesque circus. Lotti provided rambling, contradictory testimony that appeared coached by the authorities. The courtroom became a theater of the absurd, where the horrific deaths of young lovers were discussed alongside tales of drunken gatherings. For the families of the victims, the spectacle was agonizing. They were caught in a purgatory between the desperate desire for closure and the growing realization that the justice system was chasing ghosts. Every day in court was a reminder of their loss, and it's now magnified by sensationalist media coverage that treated the case like a macabre soap opera. The dignity of the deceased was buried under mountains of hearsay. As Mario Spezzi continued his own investigation with collaborator Douglas Preston, he realized the police were no longer looking for the truth, but for a resolution at any cost. Just as the legal machinery seemed poised to finally crush Pacciani, a new and even darker theory emerged from the shadows. Rumors began to circulate within the higher echelons of the investigation. A high-ranking official suggested that the snack buddies were merely the foot soldiers for a much more powerful and sinister entity. This theory proposed that the monster was not a lone farmer, but a prominent doctor, a man of high social standing protected by a secret, satanic cult. This cabal just allegedly commissioned the mutilations for use in occult rituals, suggesting that the true killer was someone far more dangerous and far better protected than anyone had dared to imagine. Pietro Pacciani's death in 1998 brought a sudden hollow end to the legal theatrics. Found dead in his home under circumstances that some deemed suspicious, he left the world before his retrial could provide a definitive answer. With his passing, the case did not close. It simply evaporated into a legal vacuum. The Compagnie di Miranda were left in the wreckage of a failed prosecution, and the state was left with no one to punish. Yet, rather than acknowledging the systemic failures that had led them to this dead end, the authorities doubled down on their obsession with a grand conspiracy. Giuliano Mignini, that's the lead prosecutor whose theories had grown increasingly esoteric, turned his sights away from the hills of Tuscany and toward the very people questioning his work. Mario Spezzi and his American collaborator Douglas Preston found themselves no longer just observers, but targets. Mignini began an aggressive investigation into the journalists, accusing them of obstructing justice and even suggesting they were part of the very cult they were trying to expose. In 2006, the world watched in disbelief as Mario Spezzi was arrested and thrown into prison. It was a dramatic perversion of justice. The man who had spent decades seeking the truth was silenced by a system that preferred its own delusions to the uncomfortable reality of its incompetence. Looking back through the lens of modern forensic science, the investigation appears as a masterclass in what not to do. In the 21st century, DNA technology might have solved the case in weeks, but the crime scenes of the 70s and 80s were hopelessly contaminated. Officers trampled over evidence, and samples were stored in conditions that ensured their degradation. The most promising lead, a partial DNA profile recovered from the back of a stamp on an anonymous letter, yielded nothing but more questions. The forensic post-mortem reveals a tragic truth. The physical evidence was so poorly handled that it became a Rorschach test for investigators who saw only what they wanted to see. The Vigna del Pacciani bullet, once the crown jewel of the prosecution, was eventually dismissed as a likely plant, a desperate attempt to manufacture a link that science could not provide. While the police chased farmers and cults, other leads remained buried in cold files. Giampiero Vigilante, a former French foreign legionnaire known as the Florentine, emerged in later years as a far more chilling candidate. He had a history of violence, lived near the crime scenes, and possessed the exact type of Beretta used in the murders. Yet, his links were largely ignored for decades due to police ego. To admit Vigilante was a viable suspect would be to admit that the decades spent hounding Pacciani were a monumental waste of resources. The ultimate realization is that the monster was likely not a member of a satanic sect or a group of bumbling outcasts. He was likely a single, highly intelligent, and meticulous individual who understood the psychology of his hunters better than they understood him. He exploited the institutional pride of the Carabinieri and the state police, defeating their biases and watching as they turned on each other. He was a phantom who thrived in the noise created by forensic incompetence and judicial ego. The legacy of the Monster of Florence is a somber one. It is a story of young lives stolen and a justice system that, in its arrogance, allowed the thief to remain at large. The true tragedy is that institutional pride became a shield for the killer. As the sun sets over the cypress-lined hills today, the case remains officially unsolved, a permanent stain on the history of Italian jurisprudence. There is a final, chilling possibility that haunts the survivors and the investigators. The real monster may have sat in the very back of the Florentine courtroom during the trials of Pacciani and the others. He might have watched the lawyers argue, heard the judges deliberate, and walked out into the Tuscan night with a cold smile.